Moving on from themes to characters and characterization, it's really important to realise that the characters are developed and presented, even that of Kipps himself, by Susan Hill. If you just think about the book being a narrative by one person, Arthur Kipps, and if you think about him as being a real person, in the exam you're going to make a massive mistake, because you must take into account the author's intentions and how the author has used language to create Arthur, Samuel Daly, Mr. Jerome, Mr. Bentley, and even the woman in black. So it's really important that you remember Arthur Kipps' first-person narration is completely controlled and developed by Susan Hill. Any questions to do with character tend to focus on Kipps, as we'll see in the next video when we look at actually some exam questions. Because it's Kipps' narrative that we follow. However, it's Susan Hill who is manipulating it. So it's very important to realise this. So Susan Hill puts a lot of effort into developing the character of Arthur Kipps, of creating him as an old man who's obviously very world-weary, but loves his new family, but has a deep and dark secret that he must unburden to the reader, as a young man who is very arrogant and headstrong and won't believe the events that are going on around him, as a man who suffers, and then a man who is tormented by evil and then finally tormented by the death of his wife and son. So the first things what you notice about young Arthur is he's innocent, he's naive, he's quite rational, he's not really one to believe in ghosts and spirits, but of course this is essential and essential for the narrative because it creates an irony in the book whereby the reader knows bad things are going to happen to Arthur, but Arthur refuses to believe they will, or that anything will have negative outcomes. It's the tension between Arthur's refusal to believe what's going on or wish to create rational explanations and the gothic events that slowly envelop and begin to destroy him that keeps the reader interested. We all know Arthur's in for trouble. The reader knows he's going to suffer. Arthur doesn't. And we read on with morbid curiosity to find out what will happen. The other characters serve really to foreground and foreshadow Arthur Kipps. They're there for him to react against, even Spider the dog. But the first character we really come to terms we notice is Mr. Bentley. It's not in the order here, but Mr. Bentley is one of the first characters we come across. First of all, as an old man, where he seems to have shown some guilt about something in the past that maybe he was involved with, but we don't really know what that is. Again, it's all part of the narrative, making us interested, making us want to find out what's happening. At first, Mr. Bentley is an ambiguous character. He seems to be evasive, he seems to have a secret. He sends Kipps to Crichton Gifford, and later on when we reflect, maybe he sent Kipps to Crichton Gifford because he was scared. And maybe that's the reason for his guilt. That's the reason for helping Kipps after these events have happened. When Kipps does get to Crichton Gifford, he meets Samuel Daly, who is a strong character with his own opinions, obviously a strong man in the village, who actually Kipps forms a friendship with and actually protects Arthur. The second character in Crichton Gifford, who actually is used again to show the horrible events and the horrible secret of the place, is Mr. Jerome. And there's a specific part in The Funeral of Mrs. Drablow where the character of Mr. Jerome is shown as scared and fearful and a victim. And he's criticised by Kipps. Again, this shows us more about Kipps's innocence, his rationalism, his arrogance in a way, and not really understanding Mr. Jerome and what he's been through. And so the massive transformation from when Kipps is at the funeral of Mrs. Drablow and says to Mr. Jerome he's seen the woman in black, and Mr. Jerome's previous behaviour, which is rather boring, reserved, normal, to actually a gibbering wreck who's grabbing hold of Kipps's arm and seeming to have a nervous breakdown, immediately signifies to the reader that something horrible is going to happen. And then finally we have the woman in black, or Janet Humphrey. She seems malign and evil all the way through the book. She seems to be putting Kipps through hell. As we read on though, our view of her changes slightly as Kipps's view changes, and we notice that she was powerless and she lost her son and she suffered a terrible tragedy. But however, that's no real excuse for what she does, and the fact that these tragic events ultimately push her into siding with evil in order to revisit her pain on everybody else. In the next video, we'll be looking at questions and how to put forward a response. It'll be a very brief video, but it will focus on a couple of questions on what you should actually be looking at to get the best marks possible when you answer that question in the examination. However, thinking about that and looking at the exam a little bit now, we can see that when you answer the questions in the exam, you must show how characters, places or events are described in relation to the genre. And the genre in this case, of course, is the Gothic / Victorian ghost story. If you're unsure of this, have a look at the first video. That's quite clearly gone into and explained in the first video. But what Susan Hill has done here is she's mixed the genres together. The Victorian ghost story, mainly focused on M.R. James's ghost stories, and the Gothic genre, which focuses on isolation, curses, suffering of the innocent, and the need for revenge. You need to also, and this is what I was talking about earlier, you must look at the way that Susan Hill uses figurative language and grammatical language to create tension, suspense and fear in the narrative. Because you're not just asked about the characters themselves and what they do, you're asked about how Susan Hill creates an impression on the reader, how she uses language to intrigue, engage and sometimes shock and terrify the reader to the best of her ability. And then finally, you need to be able to evaluate the success of those attempts. How well does Susan Hill use figurative language such as similes and metaphors, or use the dramatic contrast between characters such as Kipps and Spider the dog, strangely, to create tension in her narrative, to make the reader fear about what's going to happen next. It's very important, therefore, that you don't just look at these notes and think about them in relationship to the book, but you look back over your notes, you look back over what your teacher has taught you, you look back over exam papers to look and see what sort of questions you're being asked, so that you can understand that when you go into the exam, you can use this knowledge to answer questions on characters and characterization, the use of genre and the descriptions of atmosphere and events, and why Susan Hill is using the language in the way she is to impress the reader and create such an effective ghost story.